Ben, welcome to the show. Have you been sleeping?
No, not really. Not
No.
much. What about you?
No, no. I have. This is the way I basically do it. Is I say I've got to get to bed. I've got to stop reading Twitter. I've got to stop
Yes,
watching cable news, and so I go to bed, and then I start reading Twitter again.
exactly.
And then I wake up, and as soon as I wake up, if anything wakes me up, I check Twitter again. And last
Exactly.
night there was good reason to stay up all night. I know you very familiar with Georgia,
Yes.
have lived there at various times in your life.
Well, Sam,
And,
I appreciate you helping me with that, but I kind of had to dox myself this morning and admit that I am still in Georgia.
well, all right, you are still in Georgia. There
Yes.
you go. And that's where it appears. I mean, all the action certainly happened last night. Walk us through this, and I mean, this is extraordinary
Yeah.
because, and particularly, I mean, there's so much involved in this, not just the election, but also in terms of a message for how Democrats should approach elections
Yeah.
going forward. But go ahead.
So of course, Georgia is turning blue. The count is not complete, but Joe Biden has the lead by a narrow margin. Some estimates say about 900 votes, and I think the one that most people are seeing is around 1,800 votes, but it's razor thin. And so with that lead, it really comes as a result of years of organizing on the ground. I mean, there have been so many organizations that have put in countless hours registering voters as well as getting out the vote. The organizations that have been doing the work here in the Georgia area, they have been extremely progressive organizations. The furthest to the right you would get in anybody here is Stacey Abrams. So, if you think Stacey Abrams is a solid Democrat, every organization after her has been a left-leaning progressive organization, really pounding the pavement for progressives, and it's paying off. This will be the ball game if Joe Biden takes Pennsylvania and Georgia.
All right, so there's a couple of things to break down here, right? I mean, and you're emphasizing the progressive nature of these grassroots organizations,
Yeah.
and I mean, I guess it's conceivable that they wouldn't necessarily be progressive. You could get, I guess, sort of like straight down the line Democrats, but you rarely hear about grassroots organizations for blue dog Democrats,
Right.
right? I
Exactly.
mean, it is in many respects almost an oxymoron. I mean,
Right.
they don't they represent people who are not necessarily deeply involved in politics and certainly not willing to necessarily commit their time. It's not, I'm not saying, it's a generalization. There are exceptions to that rule, but certainly when you talk about organizers and community organizers,
Yeah.
they tend to be progressive
Mhm.
to far more, far more to the left
Yeah.
than progressive organizations.
Yeah.
Um, Go ahead.
No, I was going to say they are extremely progressive. They are some of the organizers. I know them personally, and they are much further to the left than me. Most liberals will call me a socialist. I call myself a socialist, but the organizers on the ground are further left than me. And I have to point out they are Black. There are Black organizers on the ground down here who have done an amazing job. Black Male Voter Projects, Georgia South Project. They are led by Black people. They are run by predominantly Black people because Georgia's a pretty Black state, especially when you're looking at the Democratic or the left side of the spectrum. And the margins that are coming in from Fulton County, that's a predominantly Black county. So Democrats, you're going to have to pay up for the Black community because they are actually delivering in a very substantive fashion.
And we should again state, I mean, I stated before you came on, but this is happening in a Republican controlled state, right? I mean,
Yep.
these numbers, I mean, it's not like it's Brian Kemp.
Yeah.
And there has been a tremendous amount of disenfranchisement. So, this is not that there's a lot of headwinds that activists have been facing in Georgia. And the point of this, there's two different points of it. One is this is happening with almost at the exact same time in a Washington phone call, a conference call of the Democratic caucus.
Yes.
You're hearing so-called moderate Democrats complain about the progressive, like, and this is where it gets a little bit tough to sort of disaggregate. Some of them are complaining in because there were reporters on this call, and then they did reporting on the call itself, but there were literally reporters who are live tweeting it, and I don't think they realized this on the call until they started reading it on Twitter. Some people, we had Spanberger in Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, who was, let's be clear here, she was complaining that so much press was going to people like AOC. Now, want to remind people, AOC was like one of the top fundraisers in the House, maybe the top fundraiser of anybody not in leadership. In fact, I think she was. She may have been the top 2 or 3 fundraisers and I'm talking for the Democratic Party in the House. But Spanberger was complaining about the publicity that AOC has and how much that brand is out there. Now, we also know that Republicans have a higher ID awareness of her than even Democrats did, or at least that was the case, I think, 6 to 8 months ago, because she was demonized by Fox News. Fox News has a history of demonizing women of color. That is sort of like their sweet spot for ratings. But Spanberger was also pushed out there as if she was the new national security establishment of the Democrats, or at least intellectually. And she was put out there as the one who really pushed Nancy Pelosi to impeach Donald Trump, which I think is a rather dubious claim. There were a lot of people on the left pushing for that for a long time, but it's not like she's not getting press. And she's complaining that progressives are weighing down the ballot for people in places like Virginia. And, but yet here we have a state that is not even purple theoretically, and it is going to deliver the presidency. It could very well for Joe Biden. It's, the idea that there's a runoff now for 2 senators keeps it into play, at least in the Senate, in a way a ton of different states didn't do. And this was a function of progressives doing the work.
Yes, absolutely the case. And I just, what is her name? Abigail Spanberger. She needs to know that there is no Joe Biden presidency without the left, right? Those of us, like, first and foremost, Stacey Abrams, I have to just give her a shout out. Like, I liked the majority of her work, and I think I didn't like her aligning with Michael Bloomberg, but that's neither here nor there. The fact that she helped organize and get funding for all of these organizations that went out there and did the work. And then all of the progressives to her left that got on the ground and did it. There is no Joe Biden presidency without it. And I'm sorry, Abigail, but if, wait, let me just, because I want to make sure I don't call her out of her name. Abigail, if you had that problem in Virginia, I think it's more of a problem of how much the people were drawn to you as a candidate. Because if we can flip Georgia, that hasn't been blue since Bill Clinton ran in 92. If we can flip, and now the Senate seats, it's not just the presidency, but the Senate seats. And this state is the state that is going to determine the entire trajectory of this country. Then she probably is just not qualified to be in that seat. And perhaps we need to find someone better to run in that spot in 2022.
So one of these issues, is this notion of ideology, and one of the things that also came up on that call was branding, essentially.
Yes,
where there were some progressives who were saying, why do we need to use the term socialist? Now, I happen to, one of the things that during the Bernie Sanders campaign that I was critical of was the way that he launched it in one of his early speeches, where he wanted to explain democratic socialism. And, from my perspective, and maybe this is just coming from the experience of having done mass media with Air America, and it being branded as, liberal. And at the time, liberal was a dirty word from the right, not just, it's become in many respects a dirty word on the left. But the idea of leading with that brand, as opposed to just leading with the information, comparing ourselves at that time, there was not much ideological media, as it were, out there. And the closest comparison would have been Fox. Right. MSNBC had not even really begun to position itself in that way. And, Fox never, at least at that time, when it launched and for an extended period of time, did not said it was maybe a home for people who were conservative, but it did not push itself as conservative media. It was, we report, you decide. It was,
I remember that.
but now, of course, all of their content was incredibly biased and incredibly conservative. But my point being that instead of trying to sell an academic concept to people, in terms of like broad sales, the argument that let's not call it socialism, let's just call it Medicare for all, because Medicare for all is very, very popular across all cohorts. Let's call it an expansion of Medicare, which is hugely popular with older people, with not just with younger people, with older people, anybody who's on it. And let's sell these positions. Green New Deal happens to be very popular. And certainly when you break it down and don't label it Green New Deal, it gets even more popular. The idea of like jobs guarantees and these are popular ideas. And the idea that they have to necessarily be sold as an ideology rather than I think, rather than like, here is our platform. I am far more open to that perspective on some level. But the bottom line is, we know the right is always going to accuse people of being socialists anyways. They did that with Barack Obama.
Yeah. And Joe Biden, right?
And Joe Biden.
They've pushed this notion that Joe Biden is a socialist. And so here's the thing, though. It kind of reacts to the framing that conservatives want to give in this country. And obviously, if we are negotiating on their terms, then we've already lost. But that doesn't take away from your first point about Bernie Sanders and the way he ran his campaign. To a certain extent, it was almost like Bernie was running to expand the Overton window. But if you're a person who's expanding the Overton window, then you are almost making a sacrifice fly, right? You're obviously not going to be the person who scores, but you are the person that helps the team win. And I think that's what he did ultimately, was expand the Overton window. And now we can talk about socialism or democratic socialism, because no matter what we do, they're going to accuse us of being socialist anyway. That said, I think it's also a function, it's an upcoming fight. The next fight, as soon as we get rid of the fascists, Donald Trump is gone, the next fight is going to be with the Democratic establishment, because as you stated, Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, those are extremely popular deals, like the proposals. But the people who will be blocking it are people like Nancy Pelosi, Abigail, I don't know her name. What's her name? Last name again? Spanberger.
Now, I mean, that's part of that's going to be contingent upon the Senate. They're certainly going to be able to posture differently if there's no Democratic Senate, because then they can actually sort of support things softly without having to actually have them come into play.
Right.
But the other issue with the establishment, and let's put aside like the branding and the ideology. And I think from the question of branding, yes, you can hone messages better or worse. I think, regardless on either side. I mean, it's but the other issue is that the Democratic establishment has become sclerotic. They have been stuck in, first of all, it's not just a question of age, although that may have, something to do with it in terms of like a ballast, not necessarily across the board. But it's also when people came to, when they came into their own in what era of politics.
Right.
And I want to put up this thread from AOC in response to what she heard, because part of it is also the question of tactics. And when we talk about the establishment, one of the problems with the establishment is that it has built up almost like a royal court, where there's a lot of people who are sitting there with their hands out, and their advice is often a function of what is going to put the most money in their pockets.
Absolutely.
And this is, I mean, it's not necessarily an ideological issue. You have people like that on the left, or supposedly, on the left, who are looking to enrich themselves, right? I mean, we know this, but ideology does play a big part in it, because if you're coming from a community organizer background, if you're coming from a a worker-oriented background, labor-oriented background, low-income background. And I mean, you don't necessarily have to come from that yourself, but you work in that type of environment. The motivation of going out on the streets and community organizing, that's just not a lucrative thing to do. And so you have people, here is AOC talking about this right here, where, questions of like TV. So she said there are folks running around on TV blaming progressives for Democratic underperformance. I was curious. I decided to open the hood on struggling campaigns of candidates who are blaming progressives for their problems. And almost all of them had awful execution on digital, right? And this is just one element. I mean, she knows, she understands online very well. She's young. She grew up. She was like, in many ways, sort of trained natively in this, because this is what, people in their 20s and early 30s grew up dealing with in many respects. She's also an excellent politician, and she's really, really calling out the failure of tactics and whatnot. She goes on to say that it's a little bit tight. I can't see it that well, Brendan, but maybe you can expand it. Yeah, just a little bit and go through them. But the bottom line is she is talking about, tactics and saying people, you need to be more competent at your jobs in many respects.
Yeah.
Ideology and messaging are spicy conversations a lot of people jump to, but sometimes it's about execution and technical capacity. And the bottom line, Ben, and I think this, is that we have a lot of people who make a lot of money by putting television ads out there. Yep. We also had a situation this year, which was in many ways analogous. That's good, Brendan. You could take it down. Many ways analogous to what we saw in 2016, which was a lack of volunteers, which often comes from people who are not running on any type of like platform that it shows a real distinction from their opponent, that you have trouble getting volunteers in that situation. And that means you cannot go door to door. And I think one of the things that we saw again was that in places like Michigan and Minnesota and Georgia and in Pennsylvania, it was grassroots organizations going door to door, despite the fact we had a national campaign that wasn't doing it, that basically eked out this win.
Yeah.
And we saw a failure to do that with Clinton as well.
Here's what the establishment needs to be keenly aware of. This isn't 2008. The fundraising that took place that funded these outside organizations was not turned over to the Joe Biden campaign like it was turned over to Barack Obama. That said, no matter how much the establishment cries, they aren't going to be able to stop the progressive agenda and the progressive message. Their best opportunity is to work with us, because if they continue to position themselves like they have been since Tuesday, they've come out actively attacking the progressive agenda already, which I'm kind of grateful for, Sam, because it could let me finally be free to be me, because it took a lot for me in the last 6 months to not criticize Joe Biden and just focus on Donald Trump. So I want to thank Nancy Pelosi and all of them for letting me loose. But that said, they should really try to work with us, because if they work against us, they're going to see exactly how organized we really are and how much fundraising capacity we actually have, enough to really primary the hell out of them. So I think they are really shooting themselves in the foot at this point. But I mean, far be it for me to stop them.
One of the things that I think is interesting also to look at is this notion of, and we should say Pelosi, yesterday on the program, I had Jeff Hauser on, and we both to talk about how to push Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. Even without a Democratic Senate, there's a lot of things he can do by executive order. There's a lot of personnel he can install without getting confirmed by a Senate. There's certainly Donald Trump has shown us that, even though they've been sloppy at times with it. But we're also talking about the Democratic leadership. Nancy Pelosi, in my estimation, and I think in others, failed during these 2 years.
Absolutely.
To deliver on even the very narrow promises that the Democrats made in terms of oversight and pushing the Republicans. And so this is going to be, I think, like, as we're having that conversation, I got some pushback. Like, it seems a little early to be doing this. That hasn't been resolved. Nancy Pelosi announces that she's running for a second, or she's formally declaring. but there are moderates who are pushing back on perhaps on her. I mean, some of this is generational, right? And just sort of tactical.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that the first pushback that came against Nancy Pelosi did come from the moderates. But, if they open that door, they should be aware that we're coming running in, and there are going to be multiple challenges. Hakeem Jeffries is not going to get that seat unchallenged. I can promise you that. But it does represent a generational shift. Nancy Pelosi has held on to it long enough. And it also represents a shift in tactics. You got people like Steny Hoyer, Jim Clyburn.
We having a problem with Ben's feed?
Yeah, it looks like Ben might have froze out on us.
See if we can get Ben back here for just a moment. Nancy Pelosi, like I said, did declare formally seeking another 2 years. And one of the things that gets very little attention, I think David Dayen brought it up on Twitter, but part of the deal in her last reelection as majority leader and then ultimately speaker, or I should say Speaker of the House, is that she needs 2/3 of the caucus vote, I believe, to get in, as opposed to half the caucus. And I guess the idea would be that would the caucus would vote, and then they would ultimately all vote for her for speaker. And I didn't see any mention of it in her letter saying that she is requesting support to be reelected as speaker. I hope that she hasn't forgotten that deal that she made at the time. I imagine that that Democrats remember, but and we're just waiting. We'll get Ben back in just a moment because we have a couple more things to talk about. But this is going to be the nature of the fight, regardless of what happens with the Senate. Of course, if the Democrats manage to take back the Senate, it is going to be a different dynamic. There'll be an opportunity to actually pass legislation. But if we do not have control of the Senate, then it's going to be a function of I guess messaging bills and perhaps, an opportunity for Democrats to hold Republicans to account for this past administration. Ben is telling me that he can do a Zoom on his mobile because the internet is down in his neighborhood. So can you IM Ben that Zoom link, and we'll get him on to finish up, because I want to ask him about. Oh, here he is. Okay.
Sam.
Yeah, here we go. All right, great. Not quite as
not quite as good,
but you're still looking pretty good. All right, well, good. I'm glad you're here, Ben, because I wanted to ask you. We're looking at what appears to be 2 runoffs for Senate, and before we get to that, because you're in Georgia, I want to get a sense of how much of a chance there is, and what the value is of fighting that fight, even if the chances are very slim. But before we do, I want to just ask you one more question. One of the things that occurs to me is that about 10 years ago, I guess it was, maybe it was even longer, and I don't know how many people remember this, there was an organization called Acorn,
yes,
which was which provided a lot of services for low-income people, but it also was one of the primary organizations, national organizations, that would organize low-income people to vote and to register. And the Democrats at the time were incredibly weak-kneed. You had, and it was when, online campaigns were sort of a relatively new thing, and Project Veritas did one of their hatchet jobs on Acorn, and the Democrats immediately buckled and undercut their funding. And they were community organizations, undercut their funding. Acorn went away almost overnight. And I can't help but think that, and there were a lot of people and sort of like organizations funded by Acorn that had to close and sort of reemerge. And I can't help but think that what we're seeing now is sort of the rebuilding of a lot of that infrastructure that took a couple of cycles to rebuild.
Yeah. I mean, not to be too corny, Sam, but like the Acorn the seeds, right? They planted the seeds, and we are seeing it come to fruition because there was so much damage done by the fact that the Democrats were not willing to fight on behalf of Acorn. There were so many people who actually lost connections and roots to their ability to have resources poured into communities that otherwise were ignored. And the thing we know about the organizers here in Georgia, for example, they don't give up. Like and they're not all young. Some of them have been organizing for 20, 30 years. So I almost would guarantee that there is a direct connection across the country with people who were at least a part and aware of what happened with Acorn.